Colonel Ashford's voice sliced across the dining facility like a blade. "Ma'am, I don't know how you got past the gate, but this is a military ceremony, not a soup kitchen." The elderly woman in the oversized coat didn't flinch. Her eyes, sharp and gray as gunmetal, remained fixed on the empty podium where the general would soon stand. Her hands, scarred and steady beneath the frayed cuffs of a coat 3 sizes too large, hung motionless at her sides. What the colonel didn't know, what no one in this polished room, full of dress, uniforms, and medals knew, was that the woman he was about to publicly humiliate had once held the fate of nations in those weathered hands. And in exactly 45 minutes, when the general finally arrived, Colonel Raymond Ashford's career would effectively be over. The formal dining facility gleamed with the kind of precision that only military ceremonies demanded. Crystal glasses caught the light from chandeliers that had witnessed 50 years of promotions and retirements. Silver place settings reflected the dress uniforms of officers who had gathered to honor Major General Theodore Barnes on his final day of service. The room smelled of polished wood and fresh flowers, and the particular brand of self-importance that accumulated whenever brass congregated in one place. And there, near the back wall, stood a woman who didn't belong. She was perhaps 68, though the years had carved themselves deeply into her face. Her coat was a faded olive green, clearly pulled from a donation bin, hanging loose on a frame that had once been athletic. Her shoes were held together with strips of tape that had seen better days. A worn canvas bag hung from her shoulder, bulging with possessions that told the story of someone who carried everything she owned. Colonel Ashford approached with the theatrical disgust of a man who viewed every imperfection as a personal insult to his carefully planned event. He was 52, immaculately groomed, his uniform pressed to razor creases that could have drawn blood. As the base protocol officer, he had orchestrated every detail of this ceremony. The flowers, the seating arrangements, the precise timing of the general's entrance. And now this vagrant woman threatened to tarnish his masterpiece. "I'm going to ask you one more time," he said, his voice rising loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "How did you get on this base, and what do you think you're doing here?" The woman's response came quietly, almost a whisper. "I came to see General Barnes, sir. I just want to watch the ceremony. I won't cause any trouble." Ashford's laugh was sharp and cruel. "You want to watch the ceremony?" He turned to the officers nearby, performing for his audience. "Did you hear that? She wants to watch." He stepped closer, invading her space with the confidence of a man who had never faced real opposition. "Look at yourself. You're filthy. You smell like you've been sleeping under a bridge. And you think you deserve to stand in the same room as these officers?" The woman said nothing. Her posture remained perfectly still, but something in her bearing shifted almost imperceptibly. Her weight redistributed slightly, feet positioning for balance in a way that had nothing to do with frailty. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we'd love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. And if stories like this one about courage, sacrifice, and second chances speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the forgotten heroes among us. Now let's continue. Ashford noticed her coat had fallen open slightly, revealing something pinned to the inside of the fabric. He reached forward and pulled the coat wider, exposing a single medal that gleamed against the worn lining. "What's this?" His voice dripped with contempt. He leaned closer, examining the decoration. "Let me guess. You found this at a pawn shop, or maybe a flea market. Thought you could pin it on and pretend you're somebody?" He looked around at the gathered witnesses, making sure they appreciated his performance. "This is pathetic, truly pathetic." The woman's gray eyes finally met his. For just a moment, something flickered in their depths, something cold and controlled and utterly without fear. But her voice remained soft. "That medal wasn't bought, sir. It was earned." Ashford threw his head back and laughed. "Earned, right? A homeless woman earned a medal." He turned to his audience again. "What's next? She's going to tell us she was a general?" A young master sergeant near the security station watched the confrontation with narrowed eyes. Diana Chun had served 2 tours in military intelligence before taking this stateside assignment. She had been trained to notice things that others missed. And right now, she was noticing the way the elderly woman stood, the perfect economy of her movements, the way her eyes never stopped tracking exits and personnel positions, even while Ashford berated her. Chin picked up her phone and began typing a message. Ashford was enjoying himself now. The crowd of witnesses had grown, and he loved an audience. He circled the elderly woman like a predator, his voice rising with each accusation. You know what I think? I think you're mentally ill. I think you found some dead soldier's medal in a dumpster and convinced yourself you're some kind of hero. He stopped directly in front of her. But you're not a hero. You're a trespasser. You're a fraud. And you're embarrassing yourself. With respect, sir, the woman said, her voice steady despite his proximity. I am none of those things. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb approached from the edge of the crowd, his face troubled. He was Ashford's subordinate, but something about this confrontation was making his instincts scream. Sir, he said quietly, perhaps we should handle this more discreetly. The general will be arriving soon. Ashford waved him off. The general will appreciate that I kept his ceremony pristine. He snapped his fingers at 2 young MPs near the door. You two, remove this woman from the premises. And if she resists, arrest her for trespassing on federal property. The MPs moved forward, but Chin's voice cut across the room. Wait. Everyone turned. Chin was staring at her phone, her face pale. What is it, Sergeant? Ashford demanded. Chin looked up, her eyes moving from her phone to the elderly woman with something that looked almost like awe. Sir, I ran her description through some channels. There's no record of this woman in any standard database. Ashford smiled triumphantly. Because she doesn't exist. She's a vagrant. A nobody. That's not what I mean, sir. Chin's voice was barely above a whisper. I mean her file is classified above my clearance level. Way above. Ashford's smile faltered for just a moment before returning. That's ridiculous. Look at her. But now others were looking. Really looking. Brigadier General Constance Hayward had stopped her conversation and was studying the elderly woman with intense focus. An elderly colonel near the back of the room had gone very still, his eyes fixed on the woman's hands, her posture, the almost imperceptible way she had positioned herself to respond to multiple threats simultaneously. Ashford grabbed the woman's arm, his grip meant to control and humiliate. I don't care what some computer glitch says. You're leaving. Now. The woman's free hand moved in a blur, positioning itself in a way that could have shattered his wrist in 3 separate places. But she stopped, held back, controlled herself with a discipline that had been forged in places that didn't appear on any map. Chun saw the movement, saw the restraint, and in that moment, she knew exactly who this woman was. Or rather, who she had been. Sir, Chin's voice carried across the suddenly silent room. I strongly advise you to release her arm. Right now. Ashford's hand tightened instead. And who's going to make me? This vagrant? No, sir. Chun swallowed hard. The woman whose call sign is still classified. The woman who is listed in intelligence archives as one of the most effective field operatives in the history of American intelligence. She paused, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. The woman they called Cypher. The word hung in the air like smoke from a distant explosion. Somewhere in the room, a glass shattered against the floor, and the elderly woman in the oversized coat slowly turned her gray eyes to meet Colonel Ashford's gaze. For the first time since he had approached her, he saw something in those eyes that made him want to step back. Something ancient and cold and utterly without mercy. But he held his ground. He was still certain, still confident. He had no idea that in exactly 32 minutes he would be on his knees, begging for forgiveness from a woman whose operations had shaped the course of history, and that the general walking through those doors would not be celebrating his retirement. He would be honoring a ghost. The word Cypher meant nothing to Colonel Ashford. It was just a word, a code name, probably something this delusional woman had invented to support her fantasy. He released her arm, but didn't step back. His confidence remained unshaken despite the murmurs now rippling through the crowd. Cypher. He repeated the word with exaggerated mockery. Let me guess. You were a secret agent. Save the world a few times. Nobody knows because it's all classified. He turned his audience, arms spread wide. Do you hear how insane this sounds? But Master Sergeant Chin wasn't laughing. Neither was Brigadier General Hayward, who had moved closer and was now studying the elderly woman with the intensity of someone recognizing a face from a photograph. And in the back of the room, the elderly colonel had begun making his way through the crowd, his weathered face pale. Eleanor Vasquez heard none of it. The word cipher had done something to her, transported her backward through time to a place she had tried desperately to forget. The dining facility with its crystal and silver faded away, replaced by the memory of a safe house in Damascus that smelled of cardamom and blood. 20 years ago, she had sat in that safe house with a young officer named James Okonkwo. Everyone called him Rookie, though he was anything but. He had come to the agency from Special Forces, handpicked by Eleanor herself for an operation that would determine whether 18 American intelligence assets would live or die. She remembered his smile, wide and unguarded, the way he called her ma'am until she threatened to send him back to his unit. She remembered teaching him the tradecraft that would keep him alive in a city where death waited behind every corner. She remembered the moment she realized the intelligence was compromised. It had been small things at first. A contact who arrived 3 minutes late. A signal that came from the wrong window. The particular silence that settled over a street when predators were waiting. Every instinct she had developed over 30 years of fieldwork screamed that something was wrong. But the asset was critical. The information he carried could prevent an attack that would kill thousands. And Rookie had looked at her with absolute trust and said, "I'll get him out, Cipher. You taught me how." She should have pulled the plug. Should have trusted her instincts over the pressure from Langley. Should have kept him safe. Instead, she had watched him walk into a trap. The memory of that day still burned behind her eyes. The radio crackling with gunfire. Rookie's voice, calm even as everything fell apart, calling out positions and threats with the precision she had drilled into him. The moment the RPG struck the vehicle carrying the asset, the impossible choice, save the asset or save her officer. She had saved the asset. 18 American intelligence sources remained protected because of the information that man carried. 18 families would never know how close they came to losing someone they loved. But Rookie had paid the price. His last transmission still echoed in her dreams. "It's okay, Cipher. Not your fault. Get them home." She had found his body in the rubble, had carried him herself to the extraction helicopter, his blood soaking through her clothes, into her skin, into her soul, had sat with him during the flight back, holding his hand long after it had gone cold, whispering apologies that he could no longer hear. And when they landed, when she demanded that his sacrifice be recognized, the bureaucrats had closed ranks. The operation was classified. The asset was too valuable. Captain James Okonkwo died in a training accident. That was the official story. That was what his family was told. That was the lie that Eleanor was expected to endorse with her silence. She had refused. They had destroyed her for it, stripped her clearances, buried her file, denied her pension on a technicality, erased 30 years of service as though it had never happened. She had given everything to her country, and her country had responded by pretending she didn't exist. So she had stopped existing. 4 or 5 years now, she had lived in the shadows. Not the shadows of intelligence work, but the shadows of society. Shelters when the weather turned cruel. Bridges when the shelters were full. Food lines and donation bins. And the particular invisibility that came with being old and poor and female in a country that valued none of those things. But she had never stopped remembering. Every morning, she made her way to Langley. Not inside, of course. Her credentials had been revoked long ago. But she would stand outside the fence, looking toward the building where the memorial wall held the names of fallen intelligence officers. Rookie's name wasn't there. His star had been denied along with everything else. But she went anyway, stood in the cold and the heat and the rain, speaking his name to the wind, refusing to let him be forgotten. And once a year, on the anniversary of his death, she would find her way to whatever city General Theodore Barnes was stationed in. Barnes had been Rookie's commanding officer before the agency recruited him. Barnes had written the recommendation letter that brought Rookie into her world. Barnes was the only person left alive who knew what Rookie had sacrificed, who had held Eleanor as she sobbed at the memorial service that nobody else attended. Barnes was retiring today. This was her last chance to see him. Her last chance to speak Rookie's name to someone who remembered. After that, she would disappear for good. The cancer growing in her lungs would see to that. The memory released her, and she was back in the dining facility. Ashford was still talking, still performing for his crowd, but she barely heard him. Her hand moved to her pocket, fingers closing around the challenge coin that Rookie had given her the day before he died. For luck, he had said. Not that you need it, Cypher. You're the best there is. She had carried that coin for 20 years. Had traced his initials with her thumb 10,000 times. Had whispered to him in the darkness of shelters and underpasses, promising that she would never forget. Still here, Rookie. Still trying. Ashford's voice cut through her reverie. He had noticed her hand in her pocket and was demanding to know what she was reaching for. His paranoia was amusing, she supposed, as if she would bring a weapon to a ceremony honoring the only friend she had left. She withdrew her hand slowly, showing him the challenge coin. He snatched it from her palm before she could react, examining it with theatrical suspicion. What's this? Some kind of token from your imaginary spy career? The coin caught the light. On one side, the insignia of a unit that didn't officially exist. On the other, initials that meant nothing to Ashford, but everything to Eleanor. Yoto. He read the letters with contempt. Let me guess. Your imaginary partner. Your fellow secret agent. Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. His name was James. He died so that 18 people could live. And he deserved better than an unmarked grave and a lie told to his mother. Something in her tone made Ashford pause. For just a moment, the mask of contempt flickered. But then he recovered, tossing the coin back to her with deliberate carelessness. Delusions, he announced to the crowd. Complete delusions. This woman needs psychiatric help, not access to a military ceremony. But Brigadier General Hayward had seen the coin, had seen the unit insignia that she recognized from classified briefings at the War College. And she had begun to suspect that the woman standing before them was not delusional at all. She was something far more dangerous. She was telling the truth. Hayward pulled out her phone and began dialing a number that very few people in the world had access to. Because if this woman was who she suspected, then Colonel Ashford had just made the worst mistake of his entire career. And the general walking through those doors in 26 minutes was going to want answers. Hayward stepped away from the crowd, her phone pressed tightly to her ear. The number she had dialed connected to a secure line at Langley, one reserved for matters that couldn't wait for proper channels. She spoke quietly, urgently, her eyes never leaving the elderly woman who stood motionless under Ashford's continued assault. Colonel Ashford had noticed Hayward's call and dismissed it as irrelevant. He had more important matters to attend to, specifically the complete and public humiliation of the vagrant who had dared to infiltrate his ceremony. He circled Eleanor slowly, addressing the growing crowd of witnesses like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. Look at her, he commanded. Really look. This is what happens when we fail to secure our perimeters. This is what happens when we allow sentiment to override protocol. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. And this is what happens when mentally unstable individuals convince themselves there's something they're not. The crowd had swelled to nearly 40 people now. Officers in dress uniforms, spouses in evening attire, enlisted personnel who had paused their preparations to watch the spectacle. Some looked uncomfortable. Others seemed entertained. A few had their phones out, recording video that would soon find its way on his social media. Lieutenant Colonel Webb tried once more to intervene. Sir, the general's motorcade has been spotted. Perhaps we should conclude this matter privately. Ashford's response was sharp. The general will thank me for maintaining the dignity of his ceremony. He turned back to Eleanor, emboldened by his audience. Now, I'm going to ask you one final time. Remove yourself from this facility, or I will have you forcibly removed and arrested. Eleanor's gray eyes met his. She had faced interrogators in East Berlin who employed methods that would have broken most men. She had stared down warlords in Somalia and Taliban commanders in Afghanistan and bureaucrats in Washington whose cruelty was more refined but no less vicious. This colonel, with his pressed uniform and his petty authority, was nothing. But she was tired. So deeply tired. "I only want to see General Barnes," she said quietly. "Just for a moment. Then I'll leave, and you'll never see me again." Ashford laughed, high and cruel. "You think General Barnes wants to see you? A homeless woman who wandered in off the street?" He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper loud enough for everyone to hear. "Let me tell you something, sweetheart. Men like General Barnes don't associate with people like you. You're beneath his notice. You're beneath everyone's notice." The word sweetheart hung in the air like a slap. Something shifted in Eleanor's posture. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Master Sergeant Chen saw it. The slight squaring of shoulders. The redistribution of weight onto the balls of her feet. The way her hands relaxed into a position that Chun recognized from her own combat training. For just a moment, the homeless woman vanished, and something else took her place. Chun moved forward, positioning herself between Ashford and Eleanor. "Sir," she said firmly, "I really think we should step back and wait for confirmation for my inquiry." Ashford's face reddened. "Confirmation of what, Sergeant? That this woman is a delusional vagrant? I don't need confirmation for that. I have eyes." But others in the crowd were beginning to notice what Chen had seen. The elderly colonel who had been making his way forward finally reached the front of the gathering. His name was Vincent Marsh, and he had spent 30 years in the Defense Intelligence Agency before retiring. He had worked alongside the CIA during the Cold War. He had heard stories about operators who existed only in whispers and classified files. And he had heard the name Cypher. It had been a legend in the intelligence community during the 80s and 90s. An operator who could infiltrate any organization, extract any asset, disappear without a trace. Some said Cypher was a man. Others said it was a woman. Most believed it was a code name passed between multiple operatives over the years, a ghost story to frighten enemies and inspire recruits. But Marsh had seen a photograph once. Just once, in a classified briefing about an operation in Belgrade. The image had been grainy, taken from a distance, showing a woman extracting a defector through a war zone. The briefer had called her the most effective field operative of her generation. And now, looking at the elderly woman standing before Ashford's onslaught, Marsh felt a chill run down his spine. The face was older, weathered by years and hardship. But the eyes were the same. Those gray, calculating eyes that seemed to track everything and reveal nothing. He had to be sure. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 4 decades in intelligence. He pushed through the crowd until he stood beside Chun. "Ma'am, I apologize for the intrusion, but I need to ask you something." Eleanor turned to face him. Her expression gave nothing away. Marsh took a breath. In November of 1987, an operation was conducted in East Berlin. The extraction of a Soviet physicist whose defection prevented a significant advancement in weapons technology. He paused, watching her carefully. 3 operators didn't come home from that mission. "Do you know anything about it?" The dining facility had gone quiet. Even Ashford had stopped his tirade, confused by this new development. Eleanor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. When she spoke, her voice was different, colder, more precise. The physicist's name was Dmitry Volkov. He had been developing guidance systems for intermediate-range nuclear missiles. His defection set the Soviet program back by 7 years. She paused. The 3 operators who didn't return were named Harrison, Kowalski, and Chun. No relation to the sergeant. They were ambushed at the second checkpoint when an asset we thought was secure turned out to be compromised. Marsh's face went pale. Those details were still classified. That mission had never been declassified. The names of the fallen operators had never been released outside of a handful of intelligence officials. There was no way this woman could know those names unless she had been there. "My God," he breathed. "It's really you." Ashford stepped forward, his confusion morphing into anger. What are you talking about? What's really her? He gestured dismissively at Eleanor. She's a homeless woman. She probably read about this mission on some conspiracy website. Colonel Marsh turned to face Ashford with an expression that could have frozen water. Colonel, he said slowly, I served in military intelligence for 30 years. I held clearances that you cannot imagine. And I'm telling you right now that the woman you have been publicly humiliating is not a vagrant, not a fraud, and not mentally ill. Then who is she? Ashford demanded. Marsh looked back at Eleanor. His eyes were wet. She's a ghost, he said quietly. A legend. He turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. This woman ran operations that changed the course of history. She saved lives that will never know her name. She sacrificed everything for a country that repaid her by pretending she didn't exist. Ashford's laugh was uncertain now. That's ridiculous. Look at her. I'm looking at her, Marsh replied, and I'm seeing someone I never thought I'd meet. He stepped closer to Eleanor and, to the shock of everyone watching, snapped to attention. Ma'am, it's an honor. Eleanor's composure cracked for just a moment. A flicker of something human beneath the mask she had worn for so long. But Ashford wasn't finished. He couldn't be wrong. His entire identity depended on never being wrong. This is insane, he announced loudly. One retired colonel with a head full of conspiracy theories doesn't prove anything. He reached for Eleanor's coat, grabbing the lapel to expose the metal pinned inside. If you're so legendary, prove it. Tell us what this medal is. Tell us how you earned it. His hand pulled the coat open wider than before. And this time, the full medal was visible to everyone in the room. Brigadier General Hayward lowered her phone. Her face had gone white. That's an intelligence star, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked at Eleanor with something approaching reverence. And next to it, that's an intelligence cross. Only 11 of those have ever been awarded in the history of the Central Intelligence Agency. The room went absolutely silent, and Colonel Ashford's hand, still gripping Eleanor's coat, began to tremble. The intelligence cross gleamed under the chandeliers like a small piece of frozen starlight. 11 ever awarded. 11 acts of extraordinary heroism in the shadow world where victories could never be celebrated and sacrifices could never be acknowledged. And one of those 11 hung inside the coat of a woman who looked like she had been sleeping under bridges. Ashford released her lapel as though it had burned him. His mind raced through explanations. Stolen, forged, purchased from some black market dealer who trafficked in military memorabilia. There had to be an explanation that preserved his reality, that kept him right and this woman wrong. Those could be fake, he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. Anyone can make a fake medal. Hayward stepped forward, her phone still in her hand. I just got off a call with Langley, she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes never left Eleanor. The deputy director himself confirmed that there is an officer matching this woman's description whose file is classified at the highest levels. She paused. He also confirmed that this officer was awarded both the Intelligence Star and the Intelligence Cross for operations that remain classified to this day. The murmur that rippled through the crowd was like wine through dry leaves. Marsh nodded slowly. He turned to Eleanor with the expression of a man meeting a figure from mythology. Ma'am, I have to ask. Damascus, 2003. The extraction that saved 18 American assets. He swallowed hard. Were you the officer in command of that operation? Eleanor's hand moved to her pocket, fingers finding the challenge coin that she had carried for 20 years. The weight of it grounded her, kept her present when the memories threatened to drag her under. Yes, she said quietly. And the officer who died? Marsh continued. Captain James Okonkwo, call sign Rookie. He was under your command? The name hit her like a physical blow. She had spoken it herself countless times, whispered it to the wind outside Langley, murmured it in shelters and under bridges. But hearing it from someone else, hearing it spoken aloud in a room full of people, was something different entirely. Yes, she said again. Her voice cracked on the single syllable. Marsh closed his eyes. I studied that operation at the War College. It's considered one of the most successful extractions in agency history. 18 assets saved. Intelligence that prevented at least 3 major attacks on American soil. He opened his eyes. But the reports never mentioned the officer who died. The reports never mentioned you. Because they buried it, Eleanor said. The words came out flat, empty of emotion. She had spent too many years being angry to have any anger left. The asset we extracted was too valuable. His cover couldn't be compromised by acknowledging the operation. So they classified everything. They told Rookie's family he died in a training accident. They denied him the star on the memorial wall. She paused, and when I refused to accept their lies, they destroyed me too. The dining facility had become a tomb. No one moved. No one spoke. Even Ashford stood frozen, his face a mask of dawning horror. Marsh's voice was barely audible. What happened to you? After they did that? Eleanor's laugh was soft and bitter. What happens to anyone they decide doesn't exist anymore. My pension was denied on a technicality. My clearances were revoked. 30 years of service, and I walked out of Langley with nothing but the clothes on my back and the medals they couldn't take from me. She looked around the room at the dress uniforms and the crystal glasses and the flowers arranged with military precision. I spent the first year fighting it. Lawyers, appeals, congressional offices. But you can't fight ghosts. You can't sue an agency that claims you never worked for them. And then? Chin asked softly. And then I stopped fighting. Eleanor's gray eyes were distant, seeing something far beyond the walls of the dining facility. I had given everything to my country. My marriage, my health, my chance at a normal life. And my country had given me nothing in return. So I decided to become what they said I was. Nobody, nothing, a ghost. She reached into her canvas bag and withdrew a worn leather journal. The binding was cracked, the pages soft with age and handling. She held it like a sacred object. But I never stopped remembering, she continued. Every name, every date, every operation, every person I lost. She opened the journal to a random page, revealing dense handwriting that covered every inch of available space. 12 operators died under my command over 30 years. 12 people who trusted me to bring them home. She traced a finger down the page. Their names are all here. Their families. The circumstances of their deaths. The lies that were told to cover up their sacrifices. Marsh reached out and gently took the journal. He flipped through the pages, his face growing paler with each turn. My God, he breathed. These operations. Belgrade, Kabul, Mogadishu. These are some of the most significant intelligence actions of the past 3 decades. And no one knows, Eleanor said. No one will ever know. Because the people who gave their lives for those operations don't officially exist. She took the journal back and pressed it against her chest. Just like me. The silence that followed was absolute. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, a young voice spoke. Mom? Everyone turned. A young captain in dress uniform stepped forward. She couldn't have been more than 30, with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone who had seen more than her years would suggest. Her name tag, Red Morrison, and the insignia on her collar identified her as military intelligence. Ma'am, she said again, her voice trembling slightly. I'm an intelligence officer. I was trained using case studies from operations attributed to an operative called Cypher. She swallowed hard. They told us Cypher was a composite, a fictional character created from multiple real operators to teach tradecraft principles. They said no single person could have accomplished what the case studies described. Eleanor looked at the young woman and saw something of herself. The eagerness, the dedication, the willingness to sacrifice everything for a mission. They lied to you, Eleanor said gently. Captain Morrison's eyes filled with tears. You're real. You're actually real. Eleanor reached out and touched the young woman's face with weathered fingers. You're real too, she said. That's what matters. Whatever they taught you, whatever methods you learned, you're the one who will carry them forward. You're the one who will make the sacrifices count. Morrison snapped to attention and saluted. The gesture was sharp, precise, filled with an emotion that words couldn't capture. And one by one, others in the room began to do the same. Marsh, Chun, Hayward. Officers Eleanor had never met, would never know, standing at attention for a woman in a donated coat with tape holding her shoes together. The rustle of movement spread through the crowd like a wave, until nearly half the room was saluting a ghost who had finally been seen. Ashford stood alone, unsaluting, his face a battlefield of emotions. Denial, fear, the first terrible stirrings of understanding. In through the windows of the dining facility, the headlights of a motorcade appeared in the distance. General Barnes was arriving, and he had no idea what was waiting for him inside. The salutes held for a long moment before Eleanor raised her hand in a gesture of dismissal. "Please," she said softly. "I didn't come here for this. I didn't come here for recognition." Marsh lowered his hand slowly. "Then why did you come?" Eleanor's eyes moved to the windows where the motorcade headlights were growing brighter. "Because Theodore Barnes is the only person left alive who remembers James Okonkwo." She clutched the challenge coin in her pocket. "Tomorrow is the 20th anniversary of his death, and I needed someone to remember him with me." The weight of her words settled over the room like a shroud. 20 years of carrying a dead man's memory alone. 20 years of whispered conversations with a ghost. 20 years of watching from the shadows while the world forgot a hero who had given everything. Captain Morrison wiped her eyes. "Ma'am," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We can remember him too. All of us. If you tell us about him." Eleanor looked at the young officer and saw the same earnest dedication that Rookie had carried. The same willingness to run toward danger instead of away from it. The same fatal trust in a system that would ultimately fail them. "James was 29 years old when he died," she began. Her voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the silent room. "He came to the agency from Special Forces, spoke 4 languages fluently, could disappear into any crowd in any country." She paused, a ghost of a smile crossing her face. "He called me ma'am for 3 months until I threatened to send him back to his unit. After that, he called me Cypher like everyone else." "What was he like?" Chen asked. "Brave. Too brave sometimes." Eleanor's fingers traced the initials on the challenge coin. "He believed in the mission, believed that what we did mattered, believed that the sacrifices were worth it." She looked down at her worn shoes. "He was wrong about that last part, but I never had the heart to tell him." Ashford had retreated to the edge of the crowd. His face was gray, his eyes darting between Eleanor and the approaching motorcade. The edifice of his certainty had crumbled, and he was searching desperately for something to hold on to. Lieutenant Colonel Webb approached him quietly. "Sir," he murmured, "perhaps you should leave before the general arrives. Given the circumstances." Ashford turned on him with the cornered fury of a man watching his career collapse. "Leave? And admit I was wrong?" He shook his head violently. "We still don't have definitive proof. Medals can be faked. Stories can be rehearsed. This could all be an elaborate hoax." Webb's expression was pained. "Sir," Brigadier General Hayward confirmed her identity with Langley. Colonel Marsh recognized operational details they're still classified, and half the room just saluted her. "That proves nothing," Ashford insisted. His voice was too loud, drawing attention from the crowd. "Until General Barnes himself confirms this woman's identity, I maintain that she is a trespasser who should be removed from this facility." Hayward turned to face him. Her expression was cold. "Colonel, I would strongly advise you stop talking. Every word you say is being remembered by witnesses who will be very interested in providing testimony at your review board." "What review board?" Ashford demanded. "The one that will certainly be convened," Hayward replied, "after you publicly humiliated one of the most decorated intelligence officers in American history and attempted to have her arrested for attending a ceremony honoring her former colleague." The color drained from Ashford's face completely. Eleanor watched the exchange with something approaching pity. She had seen men like Ashford throughout her career, men whose identities were built on authority and protocol and the unwavering belief in their own rightness. When that foundation cracked, they either evolved or they shattered. Ashford looked like he was about to shatter. "Colonel," she said quietly. Everyone turned to face her. "I didn't come here to destroy your career. I didn't come here to humiliate you. I came here to say goodbye to an old friend and to honor a young man who deserved better than he got. She paused. Whatever happens next, I want you to know that I take no pleasure in your pain. Ashford stared at her. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The sound of car doors slamming echoed from outside. The motorcade had arrived. Everyone's attention shifted to the main entrance of the dining facility. Through the glass doors, they could see figures emerging from vehicles. Aides and security personnel, and at the center of it all, a tall man with silver hair and 2 stars gleaming on his shoulders. General Theodore Barnes had arrived for his retirement ceremony. He walked toward the entrance with the confident stride of a man who had spent 40 years in uniform. His aide was speaking to him, probably reviewing the schedule, the speeches, the carefully choreographed moments that would mark the end of his military career. He was smiling, relaxed, ready to enjoy his final day in the spotlight. He had no idea that everything was about to change. The doors opened. Barnes stepped inside, his eyes sweeping the room with the automatic assessment of a career officer. He noted the crowd, larger than expected. The tension in the air, thicker than it should be. The strange configuration of people gathered not around the podium, but around something near the back wall. And then he saw her. His stride faltered. His smile vanished. The color drained from his face so quickly that his aide reached out to steady him. "Eleanor," he breathed. The word carried across the silent room like a prayer. Barnes pushed past his aide, past the security personnel, past the officers who stepped aside to let him through. He moved like a man in a dream, his eyes fixed on the elderly woman in the oversized coat. He stopped directly in front of her. His hands were shaking. "I thought you were dead," he said. His voice cracked on the last word. "I searched for 3 years. I had people looking everywhere." He reached out and touched her shoulder as though confirming she was real. "Where have you been?" Eleanor's composure, maintained through all of Ashford's abuse and the crowd's attention and the weight of 20 years of grief, finally cracked. Tears spilled down her weathered cheeks. "I'm sorry, Teddy," she whispered. "I couldn't. After everything that happened, after what they did, I couldn't face anyone. I couldn't face you." Barnes pulled her into an embrace. His arms wrapped around her thin frame, holding her like he was afraid she would disappear again. The room watched in stunned silence as a 2-star general clung to a homeless woman like she was the most precious thing in the world. "Don't you ever apologize to me," Barnes said fiercely. "Not ever." He pulled back just enough to look at her face. "Do you understand? You saved my life. You saved all of our lives. Whatever happened after, whatever they did to you, that doesn't change what you did." Eleanor's tears fell faster. She gripped his uniform with hands that had once held weapons and assets and the fate of nations. "I came to remember James," she managed. "Today is almost the anniversary. I needed someone to remember him with me." Barnes closed his eyes. "James," he repeated. "God, James." He held her tighter, and the room held its breath, and somewhere outside, the sun began to set on a ceremony that would never go as planned. Barnes held Eleanor for a long moment while the room remained frozen in silence. When he finally released her, his eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. "Tell me everything," he said. "Tell me what happened to you." Eleanor shook her head. "Not now, Teddy. This is your day, your ceremony. I didn't come here to take that from you." Barnes let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "My ceremony." He looked around the room at the crystal glasses and the flower arrangements, and the podium waiting for speeches that would never be delivered. "Eleanor, I've spent the last 3 years wondering if you were alive or dead. I've had nightmares about finding your body under some bridge or in some alley." He gripped her shoulders. "Do you really think I care about a ceremony right now?" His aide stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir, the schedule, the speeches. The Secretary of the Army is watching via satellite feed." Barnes turned to face him. "Tell the Secretary that something more important has come up. Tell him that a hero has returned from the dead." He looked back at Eleanor. "And if he has a problem with that, he can take it up with me personally." The aide retreated, already speaking urgently into his phone. Ashford saw his opportunity slipping away. He stepped forward, his voice carrying a desperate edge. "General Barnes, sir, I feel I should explain the situation. This woman entered the facility without authorization. I was simply following protocol by attempting to remove her. Barnes turned slowly to face him. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Colonel Ashford, he said quietly. Is that your name? Yes, sir. Ashford straightened, grasping at the formality like a lifeline. Raymond Ashford, sir. Protocol officer for this installation. Barnes nodded slowly. Protocol officer. He stepped toward Ashford with the deliberate pace of a predator. Tell me, Colonel Protocol Officer, what exactly did you say to this woman when you found her in my ceremony? Ashford's confidence wavered. I simply asked her to identify herself and explain her presence, sir. When she couldn't provide satisfactory answers, I followed standard procedures for removing unauthorized personnel. Chen's voice cut through his explanation. That's not what happened, sir. Barnes turned to face her. Go on, Sergeant. Chen met Ashford's panicked gaze without flinching. Colonel Ashford publicly humiliated this woman in front of approximately 40 witnesses. He called her vagrant. He questioned her sanity. He mocked her medals and accused her of stealing them. He called her sweetheart in a demeaning manner, and he physically grabbed her arm while threatening to have her arrested. The silence that followed was devastating. Barnes looked at Ashford with an expression that had broken better men. Is this true, Colonel? Ashford's mouth opened and closed. Sir, I had no way of knowing who she was. She looked like a homeless person. She smelled like she had been living on the streets. She has been living on the streets, Barnes said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, because our government abandoned her after 30 years of service. Because the bureaucrats decided that her sacrifices were inconvenient and her grief was a liability. He stepped closer to Ashford. And you, Colonel, decided to pile on. You saw a vulnerable old woman and you chose to humiliate her for sport. Sir, I was just following protocol. Protocol. Barnes repeated the word like it was something foul. He looked at Eleanor, at her worn coat and her taped shoes and the medals pinned inside her lapel. Tell me, Colonel, did your protocol take into account the possibility that appearances might be deceiving? Did it occur to you that the woman you were publicly mocking might have accomplished more in one operation than you've accomplished in your entire career? Ashford had no response. His face had gone from gray to white to something approaching green. Hayward stepped forward. Sir, I should inform you that I've been in contact with Langley. The deputy director has confirmed her identity and has authorized limited declassification of her service record for the purpose of appropriate recognition. Barnes nodded slowly. Good. He turned to address the room at large. I had a speech prepared for today. 40 years of service. The usual platitudes about sacrifice and duty and the importance of taking care of each other. He paused. But I think today's lesson is more important than any speech I could give. He gestured toward Eleanor. This woman saved my life 3 times. In Mogadishu, she pulled me out of an ambush with a bullet in her own shoulder. In Kabul, she organized an extraction when our own people left us to die. In a dozen places that don't exist on any map, she made decisions that kept me and my men alive while she carried burdens that would have broken most people. His voice hardened. And how do we repay her? We erased her. We denied her pension. We pretended she didn't exist. We let her spend 5 years living on the streets while we gave ourselves medals and held ceremonies and congratulated each other on her service. The shame in the room was palpable. Officers who had been watching the confrontation with entertainment now looked at their shoes. Spouses clutched their partners' arms. Even the enlisted personnel who had been preparing for the ceremony stood motionless, absorbing the weight of Barnes's words. Colonel Ashford, Barnes continued, turning back to face him. You are relieved of your duties effective immediately. You will report to your commanding officer tomorrow morning to face a formal review of your conduct. He paused. And you should pray that this woman is more merciful than you deserve. Because if it were up to me, I would end your career tonight. Ashford's legs seemed to give out. He caught himself on a nearby chair, his breath coming in short gasps. Eleanor stepped forward. Teddy, wait. Barnes turned to her, surprise flickering across his face. I know what he did, Eleanor said quietly. I know how he treated me. But destroying him won't bring James back. It won't undo what the agency did to me. It won't fix anything. She looked at Ashford with something that might have been pity. He made a mistake. A cruel, thoughtless mistake. But he's not the one who erased me. He's not the one who buried James's sacrifice. She paused. Let him learn from this. Let it become better. That's punishment enough. The room was utterly silent. Barnes stared at her for a long moment. After everything, he said softly, after everything they did to you, everything he did to you, you still find room for mercy. Eleanor's smile was sad. I've seen what happens to people who can't forgive, Teddy. I've watched them turn bitter and hollow and empty. She touched his arm. I don't want to become that. Not now. Not at the end. Barnes's expression shifted. At the end? What do you mean at the end? Eleanor's smile faded. She looked down at her worn shoes, at the floor of a dining facility she had never expected to leave alive. And somewhere in the distance, another vehicle was approaching the building. A vehicle that no one had expected. A vehicle carrying people who would change everything. Barnes seized on her words immediately. What do you mean at the end? Eleanor, what aren't you telling me? She should have deflected. Should have changed the subject, smiled, made some excuse about being tired. But she was tired. Tired of carrying secrets. Tired of pretending. Tired of being alone with truths that were eating her alive. Cancer, she said simply. Lungs. They found it 6 months ago at a free clinic downtown. She looked up at Barnes with eyes that held no fear, only acceptance. They gave me a year, maybe less. The word cancer landed like a grenade in the silent room. Barnes's face crumpled. He reached for her hands and gripped them like he could hold her in the world by force of will alone. No, he said. His voice was ragged. No, Eleanor. Not after everything. Not after I just found you. It's all right, Teddy. Eleanor's voice was gentle. I made my peace with it months ago. That's why I came today. I wanted to see you one more time. I wanted to speak James's name in a room full of people who would remember. After that, I was going to disappear again. Let nature take its course. Barnes shook his head violently. Absolutely not. We have resources. Doctors. The best medical facilities in the world. He turned to his aide. Get me Walter Reed on the line. Now, tell them we have a priority case incoming. Teddy, Eleanor began. Don't you dare argue with me. Barnes's voice cracked. You spent 30 years saving lives. Let someone save yours for once. The aide was already on his phone, speaking urgently. Around the room, officers were pulling out their own devices, making calls, sending messages. The retirement ceremony had been completely forgotten. In its place, something else was forming. A mobilization. A rallying of forces around a woman who had spent 5 years convinced she had none. Captain Morrison stepped forward. Ma'am, I don't know if this matters, but my father is an oncologist at Johns Hopkins, one of the best in the country. She pulled out her phone. I'm calling him right now. Hayward was speaking into her own phone. I'm contacting the agency's medical division. She's still technically eligible for benefits if we can get her file reactivated. There are precedents. Chen had moved to Eleanor's side. Ma'am, whatever you need, wherever you need to go, I'll personally escort you. Eleanor looked around at the sudden flurry of activity, at faces she didn't know, people she had never met, all mobilizing on her behalf. Something cracked inside her chest, not her heart, something harder, something that had been frozen for a very long time. I don't understand, she whispered. Why are you doing this? You don't even know me. Marsh stepped forward. He was an old man himself, weathered by decades of service in the shadows. But his eyes were bright with unshed tears. We know what you did, he said quietly. We know what you sacrificed, and we know that our country failed you in ways that should never be forgiven. He paused. But maybe we can start to make it right. Not the country, just us. Just the people in this room who saw what happened and decided that it ends here. Eleanor's tears fell freely now. She had spent 20 years being invisible. 20 years convinced that no one would ever see her again, that she would die alone and forgotten and unmourned. And now, in a military dining facility surrounded by strangers, she was being seen. The doors of the facility opened again. Everyone turned as new figures entered. A woman in civilian clothes, elderly but moving with determined purpose. Beside her, a young man in army dress uniform, tall and broad-shouldered, with eyes that seemed hauntingly familiar. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She knew that face. She had seen it in photographs. She had traced its features in her memory 1,000 times, imagining how it might have aged, how it might have grown. The elderly woman stopped a few feet away. Her eyes were fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that bordered on fierce. "Are you her?" the woman asked. Her voice was strong despite her age. "Are you the one they called Cypher?" Eleanor couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The young man in uniform stepped forward. His voice was deep and steady. "My grandmother has been looking for you for 20 years, he said. "Ever since my father died in Damascus." The world tilted beneath Eleanor's feet. Barnes caught her arm, steadying her. "James," she breathed. She was looking at the young man, but she was seeing someone else. Someone who had died in her arms in a safe house half a world away. "You look just like him." The elderly woman moved closer. "Beatrice Okonkwo." Her voice softened. "You knew my son." Eleanor nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I trained him. I sent him on the mission that killed him." She choked on the words. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Beatrice Okonkwo reached out and took Eleanor's hands in her own. The grip was firm, warm, alive. "My son wrote me letters," she said, "from places he couldn't name, about missions he couldn't describe. But he wrote about you." She squeezed Eleanor's hands. "He said you were the finest officer he ever served with. He said if anything happened to him, I shouldn't blame you. He said it would never be your fault." Eleanor's knees buckled. Only Barnes's grip kept her upright. The young man stepped closer. "My name is James," he said. "James Okonkwo, Jr. I was born 3 months after my father died." He stood at attention. "I joined the army because of the stories my grandmother told me. Stories about my father. Stories about you." Eleanor looked at him through a blur of tears. The same eyes, the same strong jaw, the same quiet confidence that had made Rookie such an effective operator. "He will be so proud of you," she whispered. James Jr.'s composure cracked. He blinked rapidly, fighting back his own tears. "I wanted to meet you my whole life," he said. "My grandmother spent 20 years trying to find you. After the agency told us nothing, gave us nothing, we knew there had to be someone who remembered. Someone who knew the truth." Beatrice nodded. "We never stopped looking. And then, an hour ago, we got a call." She looked at Hayward. "A general told us that Cypher had finally come home." Eleanor turned to Barnes. He was wiping his own eyes. "I made some calls," he admitted. "When I realized who was standing in front of me, I knew there were people who deserved to know." He looked at Beatrice and James Jr. They'd been waiting 20 years for answers. 20 years to meet the woman who served with their son and father. Eleanor looked at the family of the man she had lost. The man she had mourned alone for 2 decades. The man whose memory had kept her alive through the darkest years. And for the first time since Damascus, she didn't feel alone. Beatrice Okonkwo pulled Eleanor into an embrace. It was fierce and warm, and everything Eleanor had denied herself for 20 years. The older woman held her like a mother holds a child, like grief holds memory, like hope holds despair. "I blamed you for so long," Beatrice whispered. "Not because of what happened. Because you disappeared. Because I never got to thank you for trying to bring my boy home." Eleanor sobbed against her shoulder. "I couldn't face you. I sent him in. I gave the order. He trusted me, and I got him killed." Beatrice pulled back just enough to look Eleanor in the eyes. Her gaze was steady, unflinching. "My son knew the risks. He chose that life. He chose to follow you into places that would have terrified lesser men." She cupped Eleanor's face in her weathered hands. "You didn't kill him. The enemy killed him. And from what I've read, from what I've learned over 20 years of demanding answers, you saved 18 lives that day. 18 families who never had to bury their sons and daughters." Eleanor shook her head. "It wasn't worth it. He wasn't worth trading for anyone." Beatrice's expression softened. "That's not your choice to make. It was his. And he made it." She paused. "Do you know what his last letter said? The one he wrote the night before the mission?" Eleanor couldn't speak. She shook her head. "He said he finally understood why you did what you did. Why you pushed so hard, demanded so much, never accepted anything less than perfection." Beatrice's voice trembled. He said it was because you loved your people like family, and he was proud to be part of that family. The words broke something loose in Eleanor's chest. 20 years of guilt, 20 years of self-punishment, 20 years of believing she didn't deserve to live while James lay in an unmarked grave. All of it cracked and shifted and began, slowly, to release. James Jr. stepped forward. He reached into his pocket and withdrew something small and metallic. A challenge coin, worn smooth by years of handling. My grandmother gave me this when I graduated basic training, he said. She told me it belonged to my father, that he had given it to someone he trusted before his last mission. He held it up. When the agency finally released some of his personal effects last year, this wasn't among them. We always wondered what happened to it. Eleanor's hand moved to her pocket. Her fingers closed around the matching coin she had carried for 2 decades. She withdrew it slowly, held it up beside the one James Jr. was showing her. They were identical. Same unit insignia. Same worn edges. Same initials etched into the brass. He gave me his, Eleanor said, the night before Damascus. For luck, he said. She looked at the coin in her hand, then at the one James Jr. held. Your grandmother must have given him hers before he deployed. Beatrice nodded, tears streaming down her face. I told him to give it to someone he trusted with his life. Someone who would bring him home. Eleanor's voice cracked. I tried. God, I tried. I know you did. Beatrice took Eleanor's hand and pressed both coins together between their palms. And now you brought him home to us. After 20 years, you've brought him home. The room was silent except for the sound of weeping. Officers who had witnessed dozens of ceremonies stood with tears on their cheeks. Spouses gripped each other. Even the MPs who had been summoned to remove Eleanor stood at rigid attention, their eyes wet. Barnes cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I think, he said slowly, that this ceremony needs to be repurposed. He looked at the podium, at the flowers, at the carefully arranged seating. I was supposed to give a speech about my career, about sacrifice and duty and service. He turned to face the crowd. But I think today should be about someone else. Several someone else's. He gestured to his aide. Give me a direct line to the Pentagon. And someone find me the contact information for the director of the CIA. The aide nodded and hurried away. What are you doing? Eleanor asked. What I should have done 20 years ago. Barnes's jaw was set with determination. James Okonkwo died a hero. He deserves to be recognized as one. His star should be on that wall at Langley. His family should have received full honors. And you, he turned to Eleanor, you deserve to have your service acknowledged, your pension restored, your name cleared. Teddy, it's been 20 years. The people who buried us are probably retired or dead. Then we go over their heads. Barnes pulled out his own phone. I still have friends in high places. People who remember what actually happened. People who have been waiting for a chance to make this right. Hayward stepped forward. Sir, I've already spoken with the deputy director. He's aware of the situation, and he's sympathetic. She paused. Apparently, there's been a movement within the agency for years to revisit certain decisions made during the early 2000s. Decisions about how certain operators were treated. And James? Beatrice asked. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were pleading. Will my son finally get the recognition he deserves? Hayward nodded slowly. I can't make promises, ma'am, but I can tell you that the people I've spoken with are highly motivated to correct this particular injustice. Barnes turned to address the room. I need everyone's attention. He waited until every eye was on him. What happened here tonight doesn't leave this room until we're ready. No social media. No phone calls to friends. No leaks. He looked at the officers who had recorded the confrontation. Those videos stay locked until we give the word. Am I clear? A chorus of affirmatives echoed through the dining facility. Barnes nodded. Good, because when this story finally breaks, it's going to break on our terms. And it's going to break in a way that makes sure no one ever forgets what James Okonkwo did, what Eleanor Vasquez sacrificed, and what our country owes them both. Eleanor looked at the man who had been her friend and colleague for 40 years. She looked at Beatrice and James Jr., the family she had been terrified to face. She looked at the room full of strangers who had become, in the span of an hour, her advocates and protectors. For the first time in 20 years, she allowed herself to feel something she had forbidden. Hope. And somewhere in the distance, more vehicles were approaching. More calls were being made. More wheels were beginning to turn. The machinery of justice, long dormant, was finally waking up. The next 30 minutes transformed the dining facility into a command center. Barnes had taken over a corner table, his phone pressed to his ear as he worked through a list of contacts accumulated over 4 decades of service. Hayward coordinated with Langley, her voice low and urgent. Chun managed the security perimeter, ensuring that no unauthorized personnel entered or left. And Eleanor sat in a chair that someone had brought for her, surrounded by people who refused to let her disappear again. Beatrice sat beside her, their hands intertwined. James Jr. stood at attention nearby, as though standing guard over the woman his father had died protecting. Captain Morrison had returned with news that her father was already making arrangements at Johns Hopkins. Colonel Marsh was on his own phone, reaching out to former intelligence colleagues who might help accelerate the bureaucratic machinery. Eleanor watched it all with the detached wonder of someone witnessing a miracle they had stopped believing in. "You should eat something," Beatrice said gently. "You look like you haven't had a proper meal in weeks." Eleanor almost laughed. She couldn't remember the last time someone had worried about whether she was eating. Shelters provided food, but no one there cared if you actually consumed it. The concern in Beatrice's voice was foreign, precious, almost painful. "I'm fine," she said automatically. Beatrice's grip on her hand tightened. "My son wrote that you always said that. Fine when you had a bullet in your shoulder. Fine when you hadn't slept in 3 days. Fine when you were carrying the weight of the world." She fixed Eleanor with a maternal glare. "You're not fine, and that's allowed." Before Eleanor could respond, Barnes approached. His expression was a mixture of triumph and barely contained fury. "I just got off the phone with the Deputy Secretary of Defense," he said. "He remembers the Damascus operation, remembers the questions that were raised about how it was handled. He's making calls." "What kind of calls?" Eleanor asked. "The kind that make bureaucrats very nervous." Barnes sat down across from her. "Eleanor, the people who buried you and James aren't as untouchable as they used to be. Most of them have retired. Some of them are dead. And the ones who are left are about to face some very uncomfortable questions." Eleanor shook her head slowly. "I told you, Teddy. I didn't come here for revenge. This isn't revenge." Barnes leaned forward. "This is justice. There's a difference." He paused. "James deserves his star. You deserve your pension, your benefits, your recognition. And the people who took those things from you deserve to answer for what they did." Hayward approached, her phone in hand. "Sir, I have a director on the line. He wants to speak with her directly." She held the phone out to Eleanor. Everyone in the vicinity went silent. Eleanor stared at the device like it was a weapon. The director of the Central Intelligence Agency. The person who sat atop the organization that had erased her, that had denied rookies sacrifice, that had turned 30 years of service into a bureaucratic inconvenience. Her hand trembled as she took the phone. "This is Eleanor Vasquez," she said. Her voice was steady despite the earthquake inside her chest. The voice on the other end was male, measured, careful. "Ms. Vasquez, I've been briefed on the situation. I want you to know that what happened to you and to Captain Okonkwo represents a profound failure of this agency. A failure that occurred before my tenure, but one that I intend to address personally." Eleanor closed her eyes. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times. Screaming at faceless bureaucrats, demanding answers from people who had none, raging against a system that had chewed her up and spat her out. But now that the moment was here, she felt only exhaustion. "James Okonkwo deserves his star," she said quietly. "That's all I want. Put his name on the wall where it belongs." There was a pause on the other end. "Ms. Vasquez, I've already initiated the process. Captain Okonkwo's star will be added to the memorial wall within the week. His family will receive full honors and benefits retroactive to his death. His sacrifice will be acknowledged in the official record." Eleanor's breath caught. And the lie? The training accident story? Will be corrected. The director's voice was firm. His family will receive the truth. A classified truth, but the truth nonetheless. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face. She looked at Beatrice, who was watching with desperate hope. "They're giving him his star," Eleanor whispered. "Your son is going on the wall." Beatrice's composure shattered. She covered her face with her hands and wept. James Jr. moved to his grandmother's side, his own eyes wet, his arm wrapping around her shaking shoulders. The director continued, "As for you, Ms. Vasquez, your file is being reactivated as we speak. Your pension will be restored with full back pay. Your medical benefits will be reinstated immediately. And I would like to personally invite you to Langley for a ceremony honoring your service." Eleanor laughed. It was a broken sound, half sob, half disbelief. 20 years of fighting. 20 years of being ignored. And now, in the span of an hour, everything was changing. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "You don't have to say anything." The director paused. "Except perhaps that you'll accept our apology. It's inadequate. It's decades too late. But sincere." Eleanor looked around the room. At Barnes, who had never stopped fighting for her. At Beatrice and James Jr., who had finally received the truth. At the strangers who had become allies. At the protocol officer who had tried to destroy her and had instead triggered her resurrection. "I accept," she said. She ended the call and handed the phone back to Hayward. The room seemed to hold its breath. "It's done," Eleanor said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "James is getting his star. I'm getting my pension." She looked at Beatrice. "Your son is finally coming home." Beatrice rose and pulled Eleanor into another embrace. This time, there were no words. Just two women who had lost the same man, holding each other in a grief that had finally found its resolution. Barnes stood and addressed the room. "I think," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "that we have a ceremony to conduct after all." He looked at the podium, at the flowers, at the assembled officers. "Not the ceremony we planned, but maybe the ceremony we needed." He extended his hand to Eleanor. "Will you join me?" Eleanor took Barnes's hand and let him help her to her feet. Her legs were unsteady, her body trembling with exhaustion and emotion, but she walked beside him toward the podium. The crowd parted before them like water before a ship's bow. She was aware of how she must look. The oversized coat hanging from her thin frame. The taped shoes leaving faint marks on the polished floor. The gray hair that hadn't seen a proper cut in years. She was a ghost walking through a room full of pristine uniforms and pressed finery. But no one looked at her with pity. Not anymore. Barnes stepped up to the podium and adjusted the microphone. The room fell silent with the practiced discipline of career military personnel. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I have prepared remarks for this evening. 40 years of service condensed into 15 minutes of carefully crafted platitudes." He paused. "I'm throwing those remarks away." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "Tonight, you witnessed something that should never have happened." Barnes's voice hardened. "You watched a decorated officer of the United States intelligence community be publicly humiliated, mocked, and threatened with arrest. You watched her medals be dismissed as fakes. You watched her dignity be stripped away by someone who never bothered to look beyond appearances." In the corner of the room, Ashford seemed to shrink further into himself. "But you also witnessed something else." Barnes's voice softened. "You witnessed her grace, her restraint, her refusal to retaliate even when she had every right to." He looked at Eleanor. "You witnessed the character of someone who spent 30 years protecting this country and asked for nothing in return." He stepped aside and gestured for Eleanor to join him at the podium. She hesitated. Public speaking had never been part of her skill set. She had spent her career in shadows, avoiding attention, disappearing into crowds. The thought of addressing this room, full of strangers, made her chest tighten. But Beatrice caught her eye from the front row and nodded encouragingly. James Jr. stood at attention beside his grandmother, his father's face reflected in his features. And somewhere in Eleanor's memory, Rookie's voice echoed. "You're the best there is, Cypher. Don't ever forget that." She stepped up to the podium. The microphone hummed softly. Dozens of faces looked up at her expectantly. She gripped the edges of the podium to steady her trembling hands. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. Her voice was quiet, but the microphone carried it to every corner of the room. "I spent 30 years making sure no one knew my name. making sure I never stood out, making sure I could walk into any room in any country and be forgotten 5 minutes later. A few people smiled. Most remained transfixed. I wasn't supposed to be here tonight. Eleanor continued. I came to say goodbye to an old friend and to honor a young man who deserved better than he got. I didn't expect to be seen. I didn't expect to be recognized. She paused. I certainly didn't expect to be standing here. She looked out at the crowd. At Chun, who had first suspected the truth. At Marsh, who had confirmed it. At Hayward, who had contacted Langley. At Morrison, who had saluted a legend she thought was fictional. But I think maybe I needed this. Eleanor's voice cracked slightly. I spent 20 years punishing myself for things that weren't my fault. I spent 20 years believing I deserved to be forgotten. I spent 20 years convinced that if I just disappeared completely, it would somehow make up for the people I couldn't save. Beatrice was weeping openly in the front row. James Jr. had his hand on her shoulder. There was a young man named James Okonkwo, Eleanor said. His voice was steady now, drawing on decades of operational discipline. He came to me from Special Forces. Smart, brave, the kind of officer who made everyone around him better. She smiled at the memory. He called me ma'am until I threatened to send him back to his unit. After that, he called me Cypher, and he became the best field operative I ever trained. The room was absolutely silent. On September 14th, 2003, James Okonkwo died in Damascus. Eleanor's voice didn't waver. He died protecting an extraction that saved 18 American intelligence assets. He died because I sent him into an operation that I knew was compromised. He died because I chose the mission over his life. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. For 20 years, I carried that guilt. For 20 years, I believed his death was my failure. She looked at Beatrice. But tonight, his mother showed me his final letter. And in that letter, James wrote that he understood. He wrote that he was proud to serve. He wrote that if anything happened to him, it wouldn't be my fault. Eleanor's tears fell freely now, but her voice remained strong. James Okonkwo was a hero. Not because he died, because of how he lived, because of what he believed in, because of the choice he made to run toward danger when everyone else was running away. She straightened, and in 3 days, his star will finally be added to the memorial wall at Langley. His sacrifice will finally be acknowledged. His family will finally receive the truth. A sound moved through the crowd. Not applause. Something deeper. A collective exhale of validation and sorrow and respect. I'm not a hero, Eleanor said. I'm just someone who survived when others didn't. Someone who carried memories when no one else would. Someone who refused to let the dead be forgotten. She looked at Barnes. If there's anything heroic about me, it's that I'm still here. Still trying. Still refusing to give up on the people I love. She stepped back from the podium. Barnes moved to embrace her, but before he could, something else happened. James Jr. stepped forward from the front row. He walked up the aisle between the chairs, his dress uniform immaculate, his bearing perfect. He stopped directly in front of Eleanor. Ma'am, he said. His voice was thick with emotion. On behalf of my father, on behalf of my grandmother, on behalf of every operator who ever served in the shadows. He snapped to attention and raised his hand in a crisp salute. Thank you. Eleanor's composure shattered completely. And then, one by one, every person in the room rose to their feet. Officers in dress uniforms, spouses in evening attire, enlisted personnel in their finest. Colonel Marsh, Captain Morrison, Master Sergeant Chun, Brigadier General Hayward, even the MPs who had been summoned to arrest her. One by one, they saluted. The room filled with the rustle of fabric and the snap of hands against foreheads. 40 people. 50. Every single person standing, saluting a homeless woman in a donated coat who had finally, after 20 years, come home. Barnes leaned close to Eleanor's ear. His voice was a whisper. This is what you deserved all along, he said. Don't you ever forget it. Eleanor stood at attention and returned the salute. Her hand trembled. Her tears fell, but her spine was straight and her eyes were clear. She had been invisible for 20 years. She would never be invisible again. The salutes held for a long moment before Eleanor lowered her hand. The room followed suit, arms dropping to sides, but no one sat. No one moved. The silence was sacred, a cathedral of respect built in the span of a single evening. Barnes stepped forward and took the microphone once more. His voice was rough with emotion. "I think we can dispense with the original program," he said. "There was a time for speeches and awards and carefully choreographed retirement ceremonies. But tonight has become something else, something more important." He looked at Eleanor. "Tonight has become a homecoming." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Chun approached with a glass of water, pressing it into Eleanor's trembling hands. "You should sit, ma'am. You've been standing for over an hour." Eleanor accepted the water, but shook her head. "Not yet. There's something I need to do first." She walked slowly toward the corner of the room where Colonel Ashford still stood. The crowd parted before her. Ashford watched her approach with the expression of a man awaiting execution. She stopped directly in front of him. The silence was absolute. Every eye in the room was fixed on the two of them. Whatever happened next would define how this story ended. Ashford's voice came out as a croak. "Mum, he swallowed hard. I don't have words. What I did, what I said, there's no excuse." Eleanor studied him. She saw the fear, the shame, the desperation of a man whose entire self-image had collapsed in the span of an hour. She had seen that look before. In interrogation rooms, in safe houses, in the faces of assets who had been betrayed by the systems they trusted. "You judge me by what you saw," she said quietly. "A homeless woman in donated clothes. Someone who didn't belong in your carefully ordered world." Ashford nodded miserably. "I was wrong. I was so wrong." "Yes." Eleanor's voice was firm, but not cruel. "You were. But I understand why." She paused. "I spent 30 years teaching people to see what was really there, not what they expected to see. Most people can't do that. Most people look at surfaces and assume they know what's underneath." She reached out and touched his arm. The gesture made him flinch. "You have a choice now, Colonel." Eleanor continued. "You can let this moment destroy you. You can spend the rest of your life drowning in shame and regret." She fixed him with those gray eyes that had seen decades of human weakness and human strength. Or you can learn from it. You can become someone who looks deeper, who questions assumptions, who treats every person with dignity until they prove they don't deserve it. Ashford's eyes were wet. "Why?" he asked. His voice broke. "Why would you offer me grace after what I did to you?" Eleanor smiled sadly. "Because someone offered me grace when I didn't deserve it." She thought of Beatrice, of James Jr., of the family that had forgiven her for a death she had blamed herself for. "Because holding on to anger is exhausting, and I'm too tired to carry any more weight." She turned and walked back toward Barnes and the Okonkwo family, leaving Ashford standing alone with his shame and his second chance. Hayward intercepted her halfway. "Ma'am, I've just received word from Walter Reed. They're expecting you tomorrow morning. A full evaluation, treatment options, everything." She paused. "The director has personally authorized the agency to cover all medical expenses." Eleanor nodded slowly. The cancer, in the chaos of revelation and reunion, she had almost forgotten. The clock inside her chest, ticking toward an ending she had accepted months ago. But now the ending seemed less certain, less welcome. Beatrice appeared at her side. "You're coming home with us tonight," she said. It wasn't a question. "We have a guest room, clean sheets, a hot meal." She gripped Eleanor's hand. "You're not spending another night on the streets. Not ever again." "I couldn't impose," Eleanor began. "Impose?" James Jr. stepped forward. "Ma'am, you carried my father's memory for 20 years when no one else would. You kept him alive in your heart when the agency tried to erase him." He shook his head. "Giving you a bed and a meal isn't an imposition. It's the least we can do." Eleanor looked at Beatrice, at James Jr., at the family of the man she had mourned alone for 2 decades. "All right," she whispered, "just for tonight." Beatrice's smile was warm. "We'll start with tonight, and then we'll see." Barnes approached with his aide in tow. "The ceremony is officially concluded," he announced. "But I have one more piece of business." He turned to face the room. "In 3 days, there will be a ceremony at Langley. Captain James Okonkwo will receive his star on the memorial wall. His family will be present. The director will officiate. He looked at Eleanor. "And I expect every person in this room who can make it to be there." A chorus of affirmatives echoed through the dining facility. Barnes nodded with satisfaction. He turned to Lieutenant Colonel Webb. "Colonel, please ensure that former Colonel Ashford receives appropriate transportation home. His review board will convene Monday morning. Until then, he is relieved of all duties." Webb nodded and moved toward Ashford, who was still standing frozen in the corner. "As for me," Barnes continued. He smiled at Eleanor. "I've decided to postpone my retirement. Seems I have one more mission to complete." He squeezed her shoulder, making sure an old friend gets the care and recognition she deserves. "Teddy, you don't have to do that," Eleanor protested. "I know I don't have to." Barnes's voice was fierce. "I want to. I spent 3 years thinking you were dead, Eleanor. I'm not wasting another moment." The crowd began to disperse slowly. Officers approached Eleanor to shake her hand, to offer words of thanks, to press business cards into her palm with offers of help. Morrison gave her a long hug and promised that her father would take excellent care of her. Chun saluted one more time before returning to her duties. Marsh held Eleanor's hands in his own for a long moment, too moved for words. And through it all, Beatrice and James Jr. remained at her side. A family formed not by blood, but by sacrifice, by memory, by the unbreakable bonds forged in loss. As the dining facility emptied, Eleanor looked around at the crystal glasses and the wilting flowers and the podium where she had finally told her story. She had come here to say goodbye. Instead, she had said hello. 6 weeks later, Eleanor stood before the memorial wall at Langley. She was inside this time, not standing at the fence, whispering names to the wind, not pressing her face against the cold iron bars, straining to see the stars carved into marble. She was inside, dressed in clothes that fit, standing on legs that no longer trembled from hunger and exhaustion. The treatment at Johns Hopkins had been aggressive. The oncologist, Morrison's father, had attacked the cancer with the same precision Eleanor had once applied to her operations. The tumor was shrinking. The prognosis was improving. For the first time in months, the word remission was being spoken aloud. Beatrice stood beside her, their hands intertwined as they had been so often over the past weeks. James Jr. was on her other side, tall and steady in his dress uniform. Behind them, a small crowd had gathered. Barnes and his general stars. Hayward with her sharp eyes. Chun, who had been promoted to Master Sergeant First Class. Morrison, who visited Eleanor every week with updates on her father's treatment plan. Marsh, who had become a regular presence at the Okonkwo dinner table. And in front of them, freshly carved into the marble, a new star gleamed among the others. The director of the CIA stepped forward to address the gathering. His voice echoed through the hallowed space. "The stars on this wall represent the ultimate sacrifice," he said. "Men and women who gave their lives in service to this nation, whose names and deeds must remain forever secret." He paused. "But today, we had a star that should have been here 20 years ago. A star that was denied through bureaucratic failure and institutional cowardice. A star that belongs to Captain James Okonkwo, call sign Rookie, who died on September 14th, 2003, protecting an extraction that saved 18 American lives." Beatrice's grip on Eleanor's hand tightened. The director continued. "Captain Okonkwo's sacrifice was classified. His family was told a lie. His name was erased from the record." He looked at Eleanor. But one person refused to let him be forgotten. One person carried his memory for 20 years, through hardship and injustice and abandonment. One person ensured that his sacrifice would eventually be honored. He gestured to Eleanor. Eleanor Vasquez, call sign Cipher, one of the most decorated officers in the history of this agency. A woman who gave 30 years of her life to this country and received nothing in return but betrayal. He paused. "Today, we begin to correct that injustice." An aide stepped forward carrying a velvet box. The director opened it to reveal a medal that gleamed gold in the soft light. "The Distinguished Intelligence Cross," the director said, "awarded for extraordinary heroism in the face of grave danger. Only the second time in history this medal has been awarded to the same individual twice." Eleanor's breath caught. She had already received the Intelligence Cross decades ago for an operation in East Berlin. To receive it again was unprecedented. The director pinned the medal to her lapel, beside the intelligence star she had worn inside her coat for 20 years. The weight of it was almost nothing. The weight of what it represented was almost everything. This agency failed you, the director said quietly, for her ears alone. We failed Captain Okonkwo. We failed his family. We failed every principle we claim to uphold. He met her eyes. I can't undo the past, but I can promise that your story will be told to every new officer who walks through these doors. Your sacrifice will become part of our training. Your example will shape the next generation. Eleanor nodded slowly. Make sure they know about James, she said. He's the real hero. They will. The director stepped back. They all will. The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence. 50 people standing motionless before the wall of stars, honoring the dead who could never be named. When it was over, Eleanor remained behind as the crowd dispersed. Beatrice and James Jr. waited at a respectful distance, understanding that she needed this moment alone. She reached up and touched the newest star. The marble was cool beneath her fingers, smooth and permanent and finally real. I kept my promise, she whispered. I told them about you. Everyone knows now, rookie. Everyone knows what you did. She traced the edges of the star, memorizing its shape, its position among the others. Your mother is incredible, she continued. Strong like you. And your son. God, James, you should see your son. He has your eyes, your smile, your ridiculous courage. She laughed softly through her tears. He calls me grandmother now. Can you believe that? Me, a grandmother. The marble gave no response. But Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. Something that had been knotted for 20 years, finally beginning to unravel. I'm going to be okay, she said. I didn't think I would be. I thought I would die under a bridge somewhere, alone and forgotten, and maybe that's what I deserved. But your family wouldn't let me. Teddy wouldn't let me. She paused. You wouldn't let me. She pressed her palm flat against the star. I'm not going to say goodbye, she said, because you're not really gone. You're in your mother's strength and your son's smile, and every lesson I ever taught about sacrifice and duty and love. She took a deep breath. I'm going to keep living, rookie. For both of us. I'm going to keep trying. She lowered her hand and stepped back. James Jr. appeared at her side. He didn't speak, just offered his arm, steady and strong. Eleanor took it. Together, they walked away from a wall, toward the light streaming through the windows, toward the family waiting to take her home. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes walk among us in forms we might not recognize, please consider subscribing to this channel and share in the comments. Who is the quiet hero in your life? The person whose sacrifices go unnoticed, whose dignity endures despite hardship, whose service deserves recognition. Sometimes the greatest warriors are not the ones in uniform. Sometimes they are the ones we pass on the street without a second glance. Look closer. See deeper. Honor the hidden heroes in your own life. Outside Langley, the spring sun was warm on Eleanor's face. Cherry blossoms drifted on the breeze like pink snow. Beatrice was waiting by the car, already planning dinner, already talking about the garden she wanted Eleanor to help her plant. A new chapter, a new family, a new reason to live. Eleanor Vasquez, call sign Cypher, had spent 30 years in the shadows protecting her country. She had spent 5 years in the streets punishing herself for sins that were never hers alone. And now, at 68 years old, she was finally stepping into the light. Still here, rookie, she murmured as James Jr. helped her into the car. Still trying. And for the first time in 20 years, she wasn't trying alone.